The Boy and the Goldlock, written by Michael Lieber, narrated by Peter Walters. Chapter 1. It was a beautiful day in the hot month of May, and a skinny, poor but oh so handsome boy named Edwin was trudging with his axe through a summer green forest, gathering firewood for the evening. Edwin was very fond of collecting wood in the wood. It was quite good exercise, and a welcome hour away from his town of Dimble-down-the-Hill, where he lived with his mother and sister in the smallest of hovels, which is a very small house. Very often Edwin would spot a squirrel climbing up a tree and think to himself how delightful it would be to be a squirrel, with no worries or responsibilities, no school, no ill mother shouting at him, no rent-hungry landlord banging on the door. Bang, bang, bang. No, none of that here. Here, in the forest, Edwin was happy and free to do and say whatever he liked. He could whack the thick tree with a sturdy stick and pretend to be a knight of King Arthur's court. He could throw big rocks in the stream and hear them go splash. He could close his eyes and listen to the gimbling stream, the wild wind, an angry grizzly bear growling behind him. Behind him, behind him. Edwin turned round quick to an aggressive brown bear coming closer and closer towards him, its tremendous weight snapping fallen tree branches underfoot. Trying his best to stay calm, Edwin remembered once in school his best mate Ben saying something like, "Bears are easy to scare off. Just make yourself look as big as possible and wave your arms about." Or was it Jim who said it? It may have been Jim, he thought. Growl, went the bear, hot vapour misting the sides of its large mouth. Being quite a short boy for his age, Edwin knew it would have to be a big performance on his part, with lots of shouting and waving of the axe. But before he could do anything, the bear beat him to it by rearing up on its back legs 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 with a roar. Trembling, Edwin took off through the trees with a loud schwimper, which is a combination of a scream and a whimper, all the while the terrible bear charging after him. Growl! After a few minutes of running deep and deeper still into a maze of branches, and the bear showing no signs of stopping, 2 very important thoughts flashed across Edwin's mind. 1, he was getting very, very lost, and had no idea where he was, and 2, his legs, his little legs, were getting tired. He was starting to slow down, and if the bear caught him, that's the end of Edwin. For sure, that's the end, he thought. His only chance was to climb a tree, but which one? If he didn't pick one soon, he wouldn't have enough energy to climb, and then by a stroke of good fortune, a splendid oak with long, climbable branches appeared at the end of a clearing. Sprinting the open air, he reached it just in time and climbed the oak in a tired huff, pulling himself up to safety, axe at the ready. Growl, went the bear, rearing up on the trees. He can't climb, he's too heavy and fat and ugly, said Edwin, sticking out his tongue. In that moment a dead rabbit was tossed from a patch of tall ferns and rolled under the bear's drooling mouth, sniffing around it. The bear ate it up, whole with a hungry snarl, and almost instantly its stomach began to rumble very loudly, and again even louder. Rumble, rumble, tummy, tum, rumble. And then, to Edwin's absolute befuddlement, the bear keeled over and died. But this strange happening was nothing compared to what happened next. As Edwin watched from the safety of his high branch, a 3-foot-tall, hairy yellow thing came walking out of the ferns and began attacking the bear's belly with a sharp stone. It had the snout of a pig, and all its yellow fur was tied up in golden bunches. "What a bizarre creature it looks, like a baby pig covered in pigtails all over its body," said Edwin, lowering himself from the branch and dropping down right in front of the Goldlock. As soon as it saw him, its little mouth fell open silently as it toppled over backwards. Then the Goldlock got up, brushed itself off, and carried on doing what it was doing, namely cutting a long gash in the bear's stomach. "I've never seen anything like you before. You're so little," said Edwin curiously. The Goldlock looked over at him. "Same for you," it said with a gravelly voice. Excited, Edwin was quick to respond. "You've never met a person before, then how can you speak?" "Me taught words by lost parrot. When parrot no word, parrot goed," replied the Goldlock with a nod. "Well, whatever you are or whatever you're doing, you just saved my whole life. God bless you truly." "No save, me shelter. Sky go bad." "Shelter?" exclaimed Edwin, confused. The Goldlock then pried open the bear's big belly with 2 large sticks, and then walked inside the massive beast and returned with one of its innards. Tossing it aside, it went back in and then out again, this time with one of its lungs, and again tossed to the ferns. This went on for quite some time. The toss of a heart, the toss of a kidney, and as the last bit of belly was thrown to the bushes, it began to rain. Shuffling about, the Goldlock made itself comfortable inside the warm bear and started rubbing its little hands together for warmth. "It died? Why?" asked Edwin, his hair going dark and drippy in the rain. "Hopper stuffed with black fungo. You in, said the Goldlock, making space for him inside the bear. Not wanting to, but doing it anyway, Edwin went and sat down beside the Goldlock, and to his nose it smelt truly awful. Even worse than the dead bear, if you can believe it. Like rotten eggs mixed with gone-off goat's milk. He even had to pinch his nose whenever it came too close, or else he might gag and throw up and lose what little food he had that day. The Goldlock was also impressively ugly. In fact, the only part of it that wasn't ugly was its large blue eyes that were very sad and soulful, and would twinkle whenever it looked up at the trees. "Do you have a name? Mine's Edwin. Do you like my name? Do you not wear shoes? I need new shoes. Got a big hole in my lefty." The Goldlock then closed its eyes for a brief moment and responded with a single word, which was said long and hushed, as if it was the most important word in the world. "Edwin." "Yes, that's right. Do you like it? My name. Do you have any brothers or sisters? I have a sister. Her name's Elle. She's really good at a lot of stuff. Do you live here alone? I'm not very good at stuff." "Why, you wormy," said the Goldlock with a snort, referring to Edwin's constant shuffle. Edwin looked slightly embarrassed. "Toilet. Need it." The Goldlock gave a second grunt and pointed to a forested slope. "Plop hole nose. Used tree by round rock. Plenty dock leaves." Desperately caught short, Edwin stood, hitched up his soggy trousers and quickly ran up the slope to the round rock where he relieved himself up against a big tree. As he finished, he spotted something yellow and gleaming amongst the grass. "It can't be. It simply can't be," he thought, kneeling down. But it was indeed a nugget of solid gold. He picked it up and held it in his hand. He had learned many things about it. He had seen pictures of it. The pharaohs of Egypt adored gold. Their cups were made of it. Their cloths were made of it. They even ate it on very special occasions. Feeling strange, Edwin came down from the hill, just staring at it. He had never seen something so valuable before. He sat down on the wet ground, fondling the gold between his little fingers. It was then that the Goldlock looked over at him and made a revolted face.
"Yuck! You handling my poo! Yucky, yucky!"
Edwin's colourful eyes went wide as he held up the nugget. This is your droppings?"
"Okay, away, throw it away."
As the Goldlock turned from him, Edwin put the nugget hastily in his pocket. It was then that he remembered just how very lost he was in the forest. He had forgotten his compass, and to worsen the matter, it was starting to get very cold and dark. "Do you know the way back to town?"
"Town?"
said the Goldlock, not knowing what the word meant. In that moment, with great luck, the very faint sound of church bells began to ring off in the distance. "Bells," said Edwin, jumping up. "I can follow the bells." Knowing he only had a few minutes before they stopped, he quickly thanked the Goldlock again for saving his life and started through the forest as fast as a fox, following the bells as best he could. Soon they ceased, but gave just enough direction for Edwin to trace his way back, and after half an hour of sprinting through the trees, he finally emerged from the edge of the forest, soaking wet, covered in mud, and limping towards the town. Edwin was scared to put his hand in his pocket, scared that it was all made up. The Goldlock, just like being a knight of King Arthur's court, or pretending to be the world's strongest man when he threw the rocks in the stream. Slowly his shaking hand reached into his pocket. He was sure there was nothing there. "Stupid imagination," he said, but then he felt something. He balled it up in his little fist and pulled it carefully out of his pocket. A button, for sure, a button. He opened his hand, and there, clear as the night sky, was the gold nugget, and under the full moon Edwin began to cry. The cry turned into a tearful giggle, and then finally he fell silent for a long, long while. Upon reaching the hovel, his mother and Elle asked where he had come by the gold. Edwin quickly replied, and lied, and said he had done an honest day's work for a wealthy merchant. Mr. Oldfellow his name was. He was very old too, Mamma, ancient in fact. To say little of their poverty, the unexpected gold meant so very much. It was given to their landlord, which paid for 2 whole months, but bringing back gold instead of firewood had its effect, and in the days to follow, the hovel turned very draughty and cold.
"It's bloomin' freezing! Back to the forest, boy! Get chopping!"
coughed his ill mother from the other room. Edwin and Elle only just heard the angry order over the sound of their playful giggling. Elle was teaching him how to juggle with lumps of ashwood, and their hands were very black and messy. "I'll get your axe," she said sweetly. "I put a new grip on it for you. It will stop you getting splinters." And with a warm smile that seemed out of place in their bleak surroundings, she flicked her brilliant hair, which was a little black bob, and zipped into the other room to fetch it. Ella, or sometimes Ellie, if they were teasing each other, was his only sibling, 1 year older at 8½ and the only bright star in his world. She was kind, clever, ambitious, a good joke-teller, and even knew all the planets of the solar system by heart, including their order, and in the best of ways, Edwin envied everything about her, for he was not the brightest and he knew it. He did, however, take pride in his boyish good looks, and also being a good trier, he would try to be funny, he would try to be smart, and often failed. He would try to be so many things that came naturally to El. But when it came to adventure and being adventurous, his muddy mug and dirty fingernails were truly unchallenged, and by Edwin's reckoning, this was the mark of a hero, of Lancelot, of Achilles, of John Wayne. Names from a book he read, they were all in the same gang as far as he was concerned. The forest could be seen from the dusty back window, the hovel and trees only separated by an acre of flat land, and this time Edwin made sure he was made up for any event. He prepared a brown satchel with a piece of stale bread, his toy soldier in case he got bored, his new gripped axe, as well as a thimble lent from El, something to hold on to in the event of dying, and most importantly, he remembered to pocket the compass, and with a determined smile, he set off to the edge of the forest and, behold, trying to make his way back to that marvellous oak tree at the end of that beautiful clearing where it was. This time he was Billy the Kid with an impressive long gun which looked curiously like a backwoods axe, and the way Edwin saw it, he could now get as lost as he liked. Now he had his trusty compass, and lost he was after a while, searching with great leaps into the undergrowth, calling to the Goldlock in any way he could think of. "Goldie, where you at, Goldie? We're going to rob us a train." His heavenly young voice echoed through the trees, joining the wind and the rustle of leaves. Hour upon hour he blindly patrolled every possible direction. Hour upon hour he blindly patrolled every possible direction, but he could never get lost enough. He even pretended to be chased by a wild bear, like before, eagerly running and shouting among the May berries. But it was no use. "It moves about," he said, out of breath. "It must make a new home every day." But it wasn't day anymore. It was slipping to night again and turning cold again, and he even heard a wolf howling. Retiring from a good try, he picked his way back to the town, which was quite tricky, as he could barely make out the compass by the hazy moonlight. Dragging his axe lazily along the ground by one arm, he finally returned home. The wooden door made a creak as it opened, as it always did. El was so fixing her skirt in one of the chairs and wearing 3 layers for warmth. The thump of the axe being plonked by the door made her jolt from her thinking. As she watched him slinking about, her eyes turned weak. Then she looked to the other room and then back to him with a worried wilt. "Edwin, where is the wood?" she said with a trembling lip. Edwin turned white in the candlelight, filling with fears as his ill mamma appeared by the doorframe hunched with a cane, a vision of painful bowels and running nose water.
"Where is the wood, boy? Out all day you were, all damn day."
I'm sorry, I forgot."
"Forgot? Again you forgot?"
Horribly silhouetted against the wall, Mother charged bearish, bullying him into a cold corner, hitting him to the floor with her cane as El's little flailing body flocked around them, crying and shouting.
"You're just like your useless father," exclaimed Mother. "Hell down below if he's listening. Useless he is, just like you. Useless."
And with these cold hovel words, Mamma fell to the floor in a tremendous coughing fit. Bruised and beaten, Edwin miserably pulled himself up to motherly shoulders and wrapped his thin arms around her, as did El. And there they stayed on the floor for quite some time. Eventually, they helped Mamma back to her vein-covered legs and waddled her back into the bedroom, which was also the only other room in the hovel, and where all 3 of them slept. But no one slept that night. Edwin and El were dull-eyed till dawn, for Mother coughed and coughed all through the night. The next morning at school, Edwin was absent. "He's sick in bed, a terrible fever," said Elle to a teacher. In truth, the night cane event had given him a black eye, and it was decided he would stay home for a week to let it settle, which was a far better plan than Edwin's idea to wear an eye patch.
"I'll be like Blackbeard, mamma. Don't touch me booty. Me treasure is mine."
In the school days to come, Edwin tried as often as he could to look for the Goldlock. On one expedition he did manage to find the clearing, but the Goldlock was not there, nor was the bear. The wild beasts of the forest had eaten it by then. On another occasion, Edwin came by a large, reeking rock that smelt just like the Goldlock. Scratched its back up against it, maybe. But not recently, for its smell lingered longer than most. Soon the days turned into months, and the months turned into years, and although his trying never faltered, his memory of the Goldlock became so very distant, a distant day so far away, tattered by time and the passing of childhood, and eventually he dismissed the whole thing as a childish dream. He did not stop trying. Far worse than that, he simply forgot. Chapter 2. It would be a long time before Edwin was lost in the forest again, to venture so deep and desperate, but on this rare and unplanned occasion it would have nothing to do with the Goldlock or even collecting firewood. You see, he was now a teenager. My, doesn't he look handsome weaving through the willows as fast as he can, running for his life once again? Is it a bear? It may sound like bears, but if you look close, you will see it is actually an angry gang of disgruntled fathers. Edwin had become very popular with the young ladies of the town, and all through the trees, on this bright, clement day, raised and booming voices could be heard. "How dare you kiss my daughter, you penniless rat?" And
"When I get my hands on him, he's finished, you hear me, boy? Finished!"
the exhausted gang was made all the more enraged by the fact that Edwin was smiling as he ran. "I think you'll find they were kissing me," exclaimed Edwin over his shoulder. Assertively, one of the out-of-breath fathers, who hadn't been saying much, picked up a blunt rock and sent it sailing through the air. The rock was quite pleased about this because, although it was apprehensive about its desired target, a young man's head, it was nonetheless a change from the norm and almost certainly the closest thing to a holiday it would probably ever have. Bonk! Edwin's blundered body dropped in a bundle of hands and feet as he rolled like a rag doll down a muddy decline and crashed at the bottom in a fine heap of leaves. The fathers gathered in a group at the top, arguing and looking worriedly down the slope. "You've killed him."
"I didn't throw it. It was Glenn." "It wasn't me, and even if it was, you can't prove it."
"Shall we bury him?" Eventually, the fathers decided to just leave the situation entirely for fear of making it worse, and headed back to town. As all fell silent in the leafy dingle, a single red squirrel zipped along the ground to inspect a passed-out Edwin and even crawled on his chest. Its little nose then smelt something in the air, a sour scent that made it straighten up with a wild look in its eye. A second sniff, and it hurried to the tallest tree and climbed right to the very top. The smell became so great that Edwin was revived with a gasp, gag, and a muffled gargle as he rushed to pinch his sniffer. He then sat up, and then to his feet, passing around in an angry shrug. Oh, my head. One must have caught up and knocked me one. Blue Mary, it hurts." His voice was very high and nasally because of the pinching and sounded very silly. "Why not try it yourself? Pinch your nose and say what you had for dinner last night." Edwin then remembered something he hadn't thought about in years, something that happened so long ago he could have sworn it was a dream. He had smelt this smell before. He unplugged his nose and tried to endure the stench in order to follow it, but as he was stepping an impressive patch of stinging nettles while brushing a weedy branch away from his face, the smell went away. The wind had changed, the stench had been diverted. Determined, Edwin carried on nose-blind, his poor man shoes scuffling along the ground with his arms outstretched. Soon he came by a small cave yawning along a rock face. "It's dark in there. I don't want to go in there. I might have to go in there." "I will. I won't." Standing unsure amidst a bed of nettles, the wind changed direction once again as Edwin was comforted by the full force of the smell reeking from the cave. It was so strong that his eyes began to sting as he covered his whole face with his wrist, peering over a dirty sleeve into the deep darkness of the cave. He ventured inside on all fours, for the cave did not cater for standing. His ears picked up the faint sound of snoring that appeared to echo along the jagged walls towards him. The ground beneath was cold and old, and many legged things darted over his hands as he went. Then Edwin stopped. The snoring was loud and the smell was worse than ever. Whatever it was right in front of him and concealed by the dark. Edwin produced a box of matches from his back pocket. Strick! Flicker, flicker. The match illuminated the starless space in front of him, and there, doggish and yellow amongst the raven shade, was the little Goldlock, loudly sleeping on a bed of rocks, its wee, furry mouth wide open, quivering with every snore. Soon the match fizzled out with a poof, but just before it did, the flame revealed something else, a shimmer on the ground in the dark. Edwin sought it out. He could feel it. The Goldlock had buried it, in the same way a dog would scuff up the dirt to hide its doings. Got ya! Another nugget in the pocket. His body was tingling all over, close to the edge but holding on, saving his excitement for a moment after this moment. He lit another match to seek for more. It was then that a large centipede scuttled by the flicker, making its way through the Goldlock's fur, inching ever closer to its snoring snout. Edwin moved to flick it off, but the centipede was quick and scurried fast into the Goldlock's mouth, which immediately started up a bizarre gnashing of teeth. "At last!" cried the Goldlock, its pale blue eyes snapping open, causing a horrified Edwin to drop the match and bolt backwards against the cave, and frantic to light another. Strick! The Goldlock was now sitting up, rubbing its eyelids, which were very gungy and sad. Perhaps it had been crying. "Was the crunch worth the wait? Not maybe, but what crunch would be?" it said sleepily. Turning its head with a soft snort, it spotted Edwin's face lit yellow in the darkness. As before, its little mouth fell open in silent surprise, then it relaxed back and carried on musing. No crunch worth the wait. Twin nights, twin days, no. "You've waited days for something to crawl in your mouth?" questioned Edwin. It nodded somberly. "Me feel
bad eating things smaller than me," it said, "and small things is all I eat. If it cruise mouth way, that's stupid. Me feel better about eating stupid."
Do you remember me from before?" asked Edwin.
"Oh, yes. You Ed with the wind. You smell same. You are not like the other."
"The other? Have you seen another one of me, that looks like me, I mean?" Tired, the Goldlock extended a short arm, pointing out of the cave to Edwin's concern. "Show me." The two figures, little and large, left the dark cave, blinking into the bright sunlight. Oddly, the Goldlock's demeanour changed with the outside setting. It held itself lighter, more careless, like a child at play. Excited, it pointed to a white birch tree in the distance.
"There was one of you there, and one of the other sort."
"Other sort?" thought Edwin, as the Goldlock continued.
"Other sort was trying to push tree over with its back, and other one of you was helping. It not work, though. Then they go."
"Did they see you?" said Edwin sharply. The Goldlock shook its little head.
"I was a tree that day."
"You need to stay away from people who look like me but are not me. They mean you nothing but harm."
"They mean to fungo?"
Yes, bad fungo. Bad people, only me good, understand?" It nodded quick as a toddler would, and then proceeded to pick its nose and fester on the ground for stray truffles. Trying his best to think, Edwin took comfort on a near log and pulled out a cork pipe, stuffed it with tobacco, and lit accordingly, a habit he had taken up in an effort to look more mature, but his words often let him down in that respect. Puff, puff. What to do with the Goldlock, he thought. His first idea, which was not a very nice idea, was to capture the furry gold mine, smuggle it back to the hovel, and keep it imprisoned forevermore. But Edwin was too kind-hearted for such an act, and what if someone found out? He soon decided that the best and safest way was to let it carry on as it was, free range, deep in the forest, and far, far away from the town. But how to find it again? He pondered. Puff, puff. A new idea came to him. "Is it cold at night, and in the day also, here in the forest?" said Edwin to the Goldlock. Its big round dinner-plate eyes lifted to him from the dirt. It did not say a thing. Instead, it simply got up and pigeon-toed over to him and pressed a little finger into one of his knees. Then it went back to where it was and returned to foraging. Impatiently, Edwin struck a match. Strike. "Do you know what this is, the yellow bit?" Without looking up, it said plainly,
"Saw it once in a tree. I was a tree that day too."
"Well," said Edwin, beginning his plan, "this can keep you warm when it gets cold. In fact, it's the best way to keep warm." Edwin thought to add, "and also to cook food with." But it would appear that the Goldlock hardly ate anything, the odd truffle and centipede, and with large intervals in between. The plan in question was very simple. Teach the Goldlock to make a fire whenever it's cold, and wherever it is, the smoke will rise up above the trees and signal where it is. "I'll see it from the back window," he concluded with a smile, "and follow it down to the treasure." And so the lesson began. First, you must make a ring of rocks. It prevents the fire from being unfaithful to the ground. The Goldlock mastered this very quickly. It made its bed the same way. Next came the firewood. Dry sticks will do nicely. And lastly, the kindling, which was by far the hardest thing for the Goldlock to understand. You're looking for the driest of leaves, the smallest of twigs. It has to embrace the flame. After an hour of this, Edwin found himself talking like the Goldlock, using very simple words. Yes, dry bark, good. Yes, good. It also needed to learn how to open the matchbox, and on no less than 2 occasions did every single matchstick have to be picked up from the ground after the Goldlock threw them all up in the air, and then picked one based on how pretty it was. Yes, that's it. You've got it, you've got it. Strict. The Goldlock lit the kindling, which took to the wood perfectly, and just in time a new night was forming around them as Edwin prepared himself to leave. If the fire gets low, just feed it more. Strange in the dusk. Something was different. The Goldlock's demeanour had changed again, standing with one arm behind its back like an old man, looking mournfully into the flames as if it was reliving some terrible memory.
They're moving apart, you know,
it said with a nod. Oddly worried, Edwin started backing away to leave. You're going to be okay, aren't you? Here? It looked over at him very slowly and gave a small bow. Stepping back again, carefully, Edwin began to tread into the thickness of the forest, but then stopped. He couldn't help himself. He had to look back at the Goldlock through the criss-cross of branches. It was so very still. A wise old prophet, warming its little hands by the fire, looking up at the moon. Chapter 3. The door of the hovel creaked, as it always did, swinging open, broken to Edwin's outline, a heated bliss with its small, cushioned, candle-lit corners. Things are very different now, as time is, as time does. Mother died of her illness years back, along with her name on the lips of her kin, forgotten by choice and ashes for bin. The hovel was better kept now, due to a sibling effort, although it was still very much a hovel, and indeed, Elle, in her humble sittage, resided by the fireside, collapsed in a cosy armchair, now in her early 20s and utterly exhausted, for her job is very physically demanding. Can you guess what her job is? Reverse outside for a wee peep, and you will see a well-worn market cart, and crudely painted on its side, Elle's bread and buns, 2 baps a pound. The noblest of enterprises, which entailed Elle standing, whatever the weather, for hours in Dimble Square, charismatically waving her baps about and enduring the blank, dehumanizing no eye from the public, then back home to the same armchair by the fire to warm her aching foot, muttering to herself, "No one wants to buy bread from the street," only to rise early the next morning, bake her bread and leave with her cart and start all over again. The flour for the bread was often obtained by Edwin through dishonest means, a fact that was never revealed to Elle, and Elle never let on that she knew. But surely stealing for love is an honourable act, thought Edwin, and this way of thinking made him feel much better about it. Domestically, it was very much a financial convenience. They did still sleep in the same childhood bed together, which remained both a comfort and a chain to the past, that they were eager to break. Their general state was one of feeling trapped, for they lived very poor lives, a reality that was now highly contradicted by Edwin's pocket and what lay within it. After a long, comfortable silence of sitting opposite each other, Edwin said softly, "I saw Mr. Oldfellow again." Her half-lidded eyes slowly joined with his. eyes that were no longer wide and wonder-filled as they once were, but still kind, considering. "The gold man?" she said drowsily. "The very same," said Edwin, excited, pulling the nugget out of his pocket and handing it to her. "For the bread cart," he added. Like a rattled cage, she jolted out of her tired state and showcased a long list of emotions. In that moment, Edwin was happy for Elle to have the gold. He knew it was only a matter of time before he saw smoke rising from the trees. But more so than this, Edwin had grown into a very simple man, good-looking, tall, charming, but simple, and with very plain tastes. A pint at the pub, the company of a pretty town girl, and perhaps, at a push, pie and chips on Fridays. This for him was heaven, for he knew nothing higher than that. In short, he had no idea what to do with the gold, nuggets of gold, and Elle did. She had a dream to have her own bakery in Dimble Square, Elle's bread, in big bright letters. "Maybe one day I'll have a dream of my own," he thought. Given the gold and its effects of stability, a mood of celebration ferreted around the hovel. "Let's go out," smiled Elle, a slight eye twinkle returning. "A drink on Mr. Oldfellow," agreed Edwin with equal glee. And with that, they fled the homely hovel in a rare moment of happiness. Their surroundings upon leaving were both grey and green, for they lived in the poorest part of Dimble, which stood on the edge of the town near the forest. But this was not always so. 50-odd years ago, the slums were relocated closer to the wood by the town council and commissioned by the rich. They were making a mess, they said. Their children are badly parented because their parents are still children, they said. And finally, they litter, loot, and look shifty at all times, and we simply won't have it. But all sides have their say, and in the slums of Dimble there is no better place for opinions than the Horse and Barrel, a red-painted pub for the locals. The working-class doors opened with smiling handles for Edwin and Elle. The smell of cigarette smoke and sweet pub carpet play in their noses as a close-knit community unfolds before them. A sacked baby being roughly nursed by its mother, or maybe another. The loud barstool bruisers slamming their ringed hands on the bar with an endless laugh, and the two frail ladies sitting in the corner sipping their gin and water, for they have seen it all, but still love to gasp at the gossip. Filling 2 empty chairs after a barman visit, Edwin and Elle simply smile at the surface of the table, thinking of their full bellies for the next week, only to have their pleasant sip sirened away by the sight and sound of Cecil the tramp, the local lovable down-and-out, climbing with a toothless grin onto one of the tables and dancing a jig in the hope of a drink. "I'm sexy, on ya, sexy, sexy," chanted Cecil, pulling up his mucky shirt and showing his starved ribs and hairy nipples to the tune of cheers and wolf whistles. Licking his dry lips, he turned his one blind eye to Elle and started rubbing his fingerless gloves over his body. "Elle, baby, when you and me going to get married, huh?" "You're too good for me, Cecil. You know it's true," smiled Elle, raising her beer to him. "Oh, you can't touch me, sexy Buns, baby, sexy." Eventually, a group of young factory workers beckoned the bum and offered Cecil half a glass of cider to punch himself in the nose, an act he was only too happy to perform, and one neither Edwin nor Elle had their heart to watch. And with a look, both decided to drink up and leave for the hovel, just as the dare rose to the subject of pencils. The next morning, Elle had the brightest of bright ideas and spent the gold nugget on caster sugar, cake icing, and many other fixings of a confectionery nature, and instead of a cart, Elle hired a proper market stall with a canopy, and to the joy and delight of Dimble Square, she had covered the display space with iced buns, honey-glazed baps, and sugared tarts, all topped off with a big red cherry. She returned that night exhausted as ever, but triumphant, having sold every cake, bun, and bap, and found herself smiling evergreen by the fireside. Who would have thought hot cakes would sell so well? I'm doing exactly the same tomorrow. Meanwhile, Edwin was busy with a pair of binoculars, looking for smoke from the cracked back window of the hovel. The excuse was bird-watching, and to his amazement it happened quite quickly. On the third day he saw clear as day the well-awaited smokestack sailing proudly above the trees. But before he could prepare himself to leave, a strangeness occurred. The smokestack appeared to be moving to the east along the forest and then to the west, and then it began coming closer and closer towards the edge of the forest, which soon gave birth to a clattering fireball that crumbled into a smouldering heap along the grassy flatland. Upon further inspection, it would appear that the Goldlock had accidentally set fire to what can only be described as a buck or a twigron, a male deer. Edwin found this very distressing, not just for the twigron, but for the plan that backfired, and in truth, he would have been near to tears if it wasn't for the sweet smell of freshly baked bread, scenting the air along with Elle's positive vigour calling from the other room. These look good. Belgian buns tomorrow. Another few days passed, and while Elle was out selling her bread, Edwin was pressed against the window every hour on the hour, slowly going mad, and furthermore, he was meant to be looking for employment. Up till now, his past hired history had been impressively varied, with each post being unexpectedly cut short for a variety of reasons. Mostly, he was caught stealing. But then, on the Monday, just as hope for smoke was beginning to wane, Lady Luck appeared again, the beautiful sight of ashy white smoke rising above the trees. Edwin was so excited that he almost ran out of the hovel without any shoes. Collecting himself, he briskly dressed for any and all weather, packed a bag of botched ice buns for the journey, and set off as quickly as he could. The woods were kind to him on this day. The ground was dry and hard. The ready rain and the wild wind were declaring war elsewhere, possibly France. The birds were singing, the leaves were emerald green in the sunlight, and Edwin had great nostalgia for days like this, days in the wood, the days of daydreaming. But as it is, young delusions fade and vanish, and the same goes for his childhood heroes, it would appear. Lancelot died alone in a monastery. Billy the Kid was shot dead in his bed, and Achilles died from a poisoned arrow, in his ankle of all places. Not very clever in Edwin's opinion. The smoke was close now. He could smell it in the air. Finally, he came to a brilliant stream with lush cascades of water, with the biggest one passing as a waterfall, albeit a very small one. It had worked. The little Goldlock had arranged its rock ring fire and was walking around it, first clockwise and then anti-clockwise. Was it counting something? "I found you," smiled Edwin, out of breath and coughing slightly from the smoke. The Goldlock did not reply. Tired from the trek, Edwin sat by the crackling fire, rubbing his knees as the Goldlock skipped by him, completing its fourth lap. Oddly, its smell had greatly improved. He would later discover that the Goldlock had been licking the green slime underneath the waterfall and had accidentally been taking a shower. The Goldlock stopped suddenly and turned to Edwin while pointing at the fire.
"Proud,"
it said plainly. "Yes, I'm very proud," said Edwin. The Goldlock jumped for joy over the stream and back again.
"You proud too. We proud together,"
it said, nodding to itself agreeably. Only half listening, Edwin started looking around the fire for any yellow shimmers. There was nothing. Perhaps near that patch of mushrooms, but not there either. Eventually, Edwin took to scouring the whole surrounding area while whistling a playful tune to the middling Goldlock, who was now looking over at him, in the same way a toddler would look at its leaving mother. Alas, still nothing. Feeling quietly enraged and hungry, he bottoms down hard by the fire again, roughly opens his bag and stuffed a botched bun straight in his gob. Curious, the Goldlock came nearer to a cross Edwin chewing loudly with his mouth open. "It's softer than centipedes," he said, offering a Belgian swirl from the bag. With an infant-like coyness, the Goldlock took it with both hands. Then, to Edwin's surprise, the Goldlock sat on his lap and began to eat. It was hard not to be revolted by the Goldlock's closeness, for it was extremely ugly. Furthermore, it rested its head on Edwin's chest. It was beginning to trust him. There were times where it ate slow, then fast, and by the end there were crumbs everywhere. Then it gave a tremendous burp, got up, and went to walk around the fire again. While brushing off bits of bun, Edwin couldn't help but feel for the Goldlock, and in the strangest of ways, they were the same. "How long do you live?" he said weakly. Hearing this, the Goldlock began stroking the long beard fur under its chin as it continued to circle the rock ring with very slow steps.
"As long as you, perhaps more. More in the right place. Places can change for the better."
As all fell silent again, Edwin stood up. "I've got to go now. I'll be back tomorrow. Now, if you stay in this exact spot, I'll leave all these cakes here with you. Would you like that?" As soon as he laid the bag on the ground, the Goldlock looked up at the trees with a slight smile and changed its direction to anti-clockwise. The bond between Edwin and the Goldlock was growing difficult to say the least, for it was so very vast within itself. In truth, there were times where Edwin felt inferior and even unworthy, as if he was in the company of an old prophet, wise, patient, all-knowing, only to be coiled over with guilt at the next, for what felt like abandoning a small child alone in the forest, naive, kind, and so very alone and lonely. And since it never made a home, the Goldlock was in effect lost every day of its life. When Edwin returned the next day, it had eaten the whole bag of cakes and was sleeping by the stream, its little cake-filled belly going up and down and snoring as always. With a second attempt, Edwin searched around the ravaged bag, then the undergrowth, then behind the trees, then the dock leaves to no avail. Repeating a young man's stride, he roamed with his blood up, wading through the creepers to release his anger against the trunk of a tree by kicking it repeatedly. The tree, in turn, felt gravely embarrassed by this and could sense the other tree's judgment from afar. Musing the reason. Was it deserved? Had it done something to offend, and thus making it a tree not to be associated with? "It's going to be a long while before this embarrassment leaves off," thought the tree. Heading back to the stream, Edwin laid to crane the bank, warping his reflection as he splashed cold water over his hot head. his miserable expression mirrored once more in the stream. "My stupid face," he said aloud. "My stupid ears, my stupid eyes, and that stupid gold shimmer on my forehead." His mouth slowly fell open as he stared past the running surface to a yellow-coloured rock sitting among the underwater pebbles. It was glinting, almost winking at him, as he plunged his arm long in the chilly water and retrieved out of the swill a solid gold clump the size of a cricket ball. The excitement was such that Edwin felt a goodness break within him, a surprise to himself, the way he looked at the gold, so hungrily. His small greed was growing with every shimmer. "It's the cakes," he thought to himself. "Maybe the flour, maybe the icing sugar. Either way, they're bigger, much bigger." It was then that something stung the top of his head. The Goldlock had woken up and was beating him with a branch.
"Yuck! Yucky! Throw it away! Yucky!"
As Edwin suffered the quite impressive whomps from the stick, he couldn't help but notice through the whippings that the Goldlock had also grown larger by a good 2 inches or so. Moving quickly, Edwin grabbed another rock by his heel and dashed up the grassy bank with both rocks behind his back, then chucked the normal rock as hard as he could into the trees. "I agree, yucky, yucky," said Edwin with the gold now safely smuggled in his bulging back pocket. A thought then occurred to him. If it's the cakes, the sugar, whatever the reason, the more it eats, the more it grows. The bigger the gold, the more cakes are needed. What better place for this bulging shimmer than to bring Elle's dream to light? And so, that night, he presented the gold to Elle in a happy delirium. "Mr. Oldfellow and I have come to an agreement. We're going into business together, and he has paid me up front for the entire year." Elle backed away, blinking, scared and trying to comprehend the solid gold paperweight Edwin was brandishing about. "What business? Aren't you excited? Edwin, I asked you a question. If I ask a question, I expect an answer. Look, do you want this gold or not? What business? And if I have to ask you again, I'm going to smack you," said Elle through gritted teeth. Edwin's lie was being stretched far beyond his initial expectation, but he knew enough about lying not to look at his feet nor the ceiling, which was a sure sign of a liar, and Elle was a good spotter of such things. So he took to staring at a small soot stain on her left earlobe, which was a safe place for his eyes, but a terrible place for expanding his lie, when 1 inch from the ear was Elle's glaring stare. Finally, Edwin just let his mouth gabble and hoped for the best. Land, buildings, selling. He had caught the toe of something and continued with confidence and even managed to look her in the eye once or twice. "He buys land and sells it for profit. He had me as an apprentice for a while, but given his age, I think he may be looking for a successor." Elle knew for sure he was lying, but swallowed the fib regardless. "How old is Mr. Oldfellow?" "Old," said Edwin, very matter-of-factly. "Yes, how old? He was old when we were children." "Well, I don't know. It's rude to ask people their age, and everyone's old when you're a child. Now, look, I want to give this to you. I want you to open your bakery in the square, like you've always wanted, and also find lodgings in the town and leave this awful place forever." Now there was the truth. Elle began to tear up, while remaining stern with that ellish frown of hers. "But what about you?" she gulped, gripping his shoulders. "Don't worry about me. I'm going to be fine. I do have one request, though. I may ask for a few cakes on occasion. No matter what the quantity, you bake them with love, no questions asked." Elle smiled her crooked teeth, and they both shook on it, and with tears of sadness and joy she took the gold, and within a week she had rented a small shop front in Dimble Square, and through hard work and vigour she established a fine and successful bakery. Elle's bread in big fancy letters, and conveniently the rooms above were vacant, so she rented them too. Her own space, her own bed, her own toilet. She was, in a word, happy. She also grew very fond of the bearded delivery man who dropped off her self-rising flour. Glenn was his name, and although Glenn's beard was rough and his gut was great, he was indeed a good listener and made her laugh on occasion. The history of the hovel, meanwhile, had changed yet again. Once upon a time, a family of 4, then 3, then 2, and now Edwin on his own, watching for smoke from his bedroom window. Did he get lonely? Of course he did. But due to a ready supply of glazed buns and baps, and his growing obsession with feeding the Goldlock, he had established a bright business of his own, rock collecting. By the end of the year, he had stored up so much gold in the poor little hovel that he began to feel something akin to a fairy tale dragon, sitting hotly on its stolen treasure. Chapter 4. The time had now come to spend the gold, but not for the reason you might think. You see, Edwin had been hiding the rocks under his bed, and it was starting to make the frame uneven and the mattress lumpy. The way he saw it, spending half the gold meant a good night's sleep, and so the decision was made to buy the wee hovel off the old and brutish landlord, which meant no rent, no bang-bang on the door at the end of the month, no "Where's my money, boy?" Bliss, bliss, utter bliss. And in a second act of somewhat questionable morals, Edwin also obtained the building Elle was renting for the bakery, a purchase she would never know about. But to Edwin's delight, the act of buying storefronts began to fascinate him. I buy a building on Dimble's High Street, I rent it out. The shopkeeper pays money to the landlord, which is me. It's so simple. This also seemed a much better plan than stockpiling rocks of solid gold in a broken-down hovel in a very poor area, where the local kids would steal your doormat for a giggle. No, much safer to turn the gold into something else. It's a lot harder to steal a building, thought Edwin with a smile. And with this new way of thinking, Edwin played with the idea of buying a few small shops close to the hovel. The local post office on the corner, the florist on Bog Lane, and Bettelbart's beer and wine. But then, out of nowhere, he decided to heighten his hand to somewhere else. Not 3 shops, he thought, but 1 shop, Tilbourne Tailors on Black Street, which was the most expensive street in all of Dimble, where the rich roamed proud with their beaked noses in the air. The building in question was so prestigious that Edwin felt afraid to buy it, as if he was invading on their patch. But at the last, he lit his cork pipe and bought it anyway. Puff, puff. How unlike me, he thought. He could feel himself changing. It was the gold, there was no question about it. Or rather, what wealth reveals in a person. For example, Edwin had gained an odd and overwhelming urge to improve himself, as if all along poverty had served as a great distraction, a lead weight lying heavy on his confidence, his ambition. It now seemed completely logical that he improved his standing within the town. After all, he was quickly becoming a very wealthy man and needed to act as such, otherwise people might get suspicious. But in truth, he had absolutely no idea how to go about it, who to meet, what to do, or even how to speak proper and that. So, in the spirit of progress, he decided to start with the basics, his clothes, which up to this point had been moth-eaten hand-me-downs from the old couple 2 hovels over. It will never do, he thought, and found himself street-bound, nervously wringing his hands outside his newest asset, the towering intimidation of Tilborne tailors. He could feel the squinting eyes of Black Street staring at him as they passed. Why is he here? Is he trying to steal something? Is he looking for no alarm to break in later? Very anxious indeed, he pushed slowly through the dark wooden doors. In the centre of the shop, amongst the displays of posh tweed and silk shirts, stood 2 men that looked almost identical. One, very oddly, had only half a moustache on the left of his upper lip, which was very thin and of the pencil variety. The other man was exactly the same, only it was on the right side. Their strange, gaunt faces were twisted in a delirious smile towards the door, a smile that quickly faded upon Edwin's general appearance, and to his immense confusion they began to shout at him in French, "Te laissez ça les clochards," which roughly translates to, "Out, you dirty tramp," and rushed forward, slapping him out the door. "Sale, sale, dirty, dirty." Falling out onto the pavement, an irate Edwin crashed through the doors once more, waving his newly acquired freehold papers for the building while bracing yet another barrage of slaps. "I own this building. You work for me. Understand?" The flustered twins, with their bizarre half-moustaches, wildly shook their heads. "Non, non, nous n'avons pas de nourriture pour toi." "No, no, we don't have food for you." In that moment, the sound of a clearing throat at the back of the shop caused all 3 to turn and notice. It was a rather plump and portly man, more or less the same age as Edwin, perusing a pair of Cuban heels, shoes for short men. He had red rosacea cheeks, and his hair was tragically thin for his age. "Did I hear you say you own this establishment?" said the plump man, dropping the Cubans and slithering forth. "Yes, I bought it last week," said Edwin, holding up the papers for the man to see. "Oh, then we must be introduced. Must, grinned the man, pushing through the 2 confused tailors and asserting a clammy hand. "How do? I'm Archie Badger, and I find myself perplexed. I find myself dumbfounded, nay, befuddled, for I know everyone worth knowing in Dimble, but yet I don't know you. Surname?" Edwin felt a strong desire to back away near the door, for his God-given last name was short and stumpy and sounded like a fresh-filled nappy being thrown against the wall. It was time for another lie. "Bronzeway. Edwin Bronzeway," he said, repeating a brand of pan currently hanging in the hovel. "Bronzeway? Bronzeway?" said Archie, licking his lips as if he was trying to taste the word. "I don't think I know the Bronzeways. Well, I suppose one does now, Mr. Bronzeway. Your acquaintance, pleased to meet indeed." Trying desperately not to blush, Edwin held back a smile. He had never been called Mr. before, fake name or otherwise. "Now, allow me to assist," said Archie, turning on his heels to the 2 tailors and slapping them hard around the face. "Insolence, insolence," he cried, which means the same in both languages. He then loudly explained in schoolboy French exactly what those papers meant and who Edwin was to them. When Archie had finished, the 2 tailors slammed their faces together, forming one complete moustache. Sacre bleu, they cried, restoring their grins, and attacked Edwin with drapes of expensive material. Always smug, Archie wiped off his blazer and assumed a Christ-like position with his short, podgy arms outstretched.
Don't forget about me. It's my splurging day, and splurge I shall,
he said, eyeing a worried Edwin, who was having his inside leg measured.
I get the feeling you're not very fashion-forward. Well, don't worry. Friend Archie's here. I'm going to teach you everything I know about dressing to the nines. Ouch! Easy with those pins.
After a full hour of trimmed colours and top-harassed tweed, woven from the finest wool of the Highlands, Edwin and Archie left the tailor's looking simply ridiculous.
If you feel over-tucked, overdressed and goddamn foolish, then you're heading in the right direction. Fashion is brave, Edwin. Now strut with me. Strut!
Edwin did as he was told, showboating down the street with a grinning man he had only just met. It was all too clear he wasn't dealing with the brightest candle of the upper classes, but nonetheless, Mr. Archie Badger made for a worthy ally, for he knew intimately the ways of wealth and power. This was the beginning of many improvements Edwin would make to his life, and all thanks to his newfound riches. His greasy, messy hair was washed, cut, blow-dried and styled by the finest barber in Dimble. His scruffy stubble shaved to a baby-smooth bliss, not to mention scented. He even started brushing his teeth, and if all this weren't enough to bring an honest L to teary-eyed laughter, his reluctance and eventual agreement to attend elocution lessons definitely was. Edwin now spoke properly, or rather learnt to put it on to great effect, and found himself astonished, even angry, at how well he was treated by the general public whenever he put on the voice. Doors were held open, a quicker service all round, and an instant likability. People associated the voice with good schooling, good parenting, an honourable temperament, and above all else, a very low chance of mindless thuggery, which was his usual prejudice. And due to his new smart appearance that went very well with his natural good looks, Edwin could and would mingle and hobnob with the cream of Dimble. Archie Badger opened door after door to social clubs and society meetings, which eventually led to a grand crescendo, an invitation to a private dinner party held at the home of Lady Anne Baskerville. A great honour. She was in her late 80s and was renowned throughout the rich for her stately events and eloquent nature. She lived next door to the town hall in a majestic 4-story townhouse, the stoop of which on the night of the party had a very stern doorman, wielding a firearm with orders to shoot anyone who came close without an invitation.
"My ticket," said Archie, throwing his gold-leaf invite at the doorman and pompously kicking through the entrance door as if he owned the place. Edwin, meanwhile, was timid and respectful, which only seemed to raise suspicion in the doorman's stare. He presumed upon entry that there would be a pre-dinner gathering where everyone awkwardly stands about making small talk, but instead they were rushed straight to a glorious dining room by a moody old maid and confronted by a small gathering of odd figures slurping cold soup around a humongous table with an equal number of maids and footmen with their backs against the wood-panelled walls. "You're late. Take your seats at once," said a woman holding a clipboard in the corner. Edwin and Archie quickly sat in 2 vacant chairs between an evil-looking sergeant and a proud, half-naked tribesman holding a spear between his legs.
Correcting his posture, Edwin correctly assumed the thin elderly woman at the foot of the table was indeed Lady Baskerville, and tried to show appreciation over the sound of clinking spoons. "Thank you, milady, for inviting us into your delightful home. Have you lived here long?" The voice, with extra emphasis which blended in perfectly. Lady Baskerville did not respond or even acknowledge him, but instead beckoned the help to remove the soup and to bring in the main. As the table was being swamped by an array of servant hands, Edwin looked around at the unusual guests, the strangest of which was not a person at all, but rather a stuffed leather sleeping bag, wilting in the chair next to Lady Baskerville. It was then that he noticed a middle-aged woman staring at him from across the table. Her thin mouth was smiling, but her eyes were so weak and teary, he thought she might burst out crying at any moment. She didn't speak for quite some time, but eventually raised her voice above the banter. "What does one do?" Edwin leaned forward, raising his own. "I'm a real estate man," he said, with a newfound sense of pride. "Oh, really? How marvellous! Oh, how wonderful!" said the woman, grinning ear to ear and nodding with clasped hands. At first, Edwin could have sworn she was being sarcastic in a patronizing way, but then remembered the upper classes never use sarcasm, for sarcasm was invented one cold winter's night by a working-class tot in a bathing pot. "No, the water's not freezing at all," said the tot, and so it was. The various main courses had arrived in the centre of the table by this point, but Edwin could hardly make out what any of it was. A server appeared at his side. "Twax leggins, sir." Casting his eyes upon the silver platter the man was holding, the sight was that of a spare rib, only it had scales. Declining as politely as he could, Edwin thought it wise to first learn the cutlery before venturing to eat anything, but as he was pondering an 8-pronged fork to his left, Lady Baskerville acknowledged him. "All my life," she said sharply. Edwin gazed dimly back at her, confused. "You asked how long the Baskervilles have lived here," she continued. "We have always been here, passed down from generation to generation. Isn't that right, Mummy?" Lady Baskerville then turned to the wilted sleeping bag, and to Edwin's absolute horror, a little mouth opened in the leather and made the sound of a dying toad. It wasn't a sleeping bag at all, but rather the oldest, most bygone woman he had ever seen. In truth, she looked half-melted. All the while, looking at Edwin, Lady Baskerville touched the ancient woman lightly on the shoulder. "Mummy here is actually the oldest person who ever lived. Everyone thinks it's that French tart who lived to a mere 122. But it's really Mummy. We won't tell anyone she doesn't want to deal with all those silly record people. Isn't that right, Mummy?" "Ah," said the sleeping bag, sounding more like a broken bellows than a human. During the meal, the bag did manage to groan what appeared to be words. "Where's my husband?" she croaked. Edwin's ears pricked up. She had a working-class accent, hovel speak. But before she could say anything else, a maid appeared by her side and began pouring gin down her throat as Lady Baskerville quickly laughed and overly grinned at her guests. "Mummy's very tired. She gets tired at this time, don't you, Mummy?" Mummy was then wheeled out of the dining room and never seen again for the rest of the party. After the starter, the main and a curious dessert that Edwin wasn't entirely sure was even legal, Lady Baskerville stood up and rung a little bell for silence. "I've arranged recreation in the rock garden." She then paused, taking a slow sip from her wine-glass, while everyone waited, a good while, for her to continue speaking. "I shall be joining, naturally. she said finally, because I find it helps me sleep after a big meal. She then swanned away from her chair and out of the dining room as everyone clambered to follow her through the townhouse, eventually ending up at a private courtyard which had a pretty garden. It was very dark and chilly by this time, but all was lit by green lights pillared here and there. It would have been quite a beautiful sight, Edwin thought, if it wasn't for the shivering, homeless man balancing on a football in front of a small fish pond, wearing a pair of pink swimming goggles. Lady Baskerville then clicked her frail fingers as the help brought out a bundle of spiky pineapples in a large wicker basket. She then took one up with her opera-gloved arm and tossed it weakly while shrieking, "First one to knock it into the pond wins a toffee." This sparked a frenzy among the guests, lobbing as many pineapples as they could, with a near tribesman hurling his spear and only missing the poor bum by a pixie's prick.
If you are going to throw spears, you'll have to pay me extra," said the bum. If you're going to throw spears, you'll have to pay me extra,"
said the bum. I know that voice, thought Edwin, turning wide-eyed. It was Cecil the tramp from the pub.
"This is awful, truly awful,"
said Archie. But before Edwin could agree, Archie then added, "I hate pineapples." Luckily for Cecil, all the guests were either too old to throw far enough or couldn't throw, full stop. But to Edwin's dismay, the help plopped a large pine into his hands.
"Show them how it's done,"
said Archie, slapping him on the back. Just as he was about to pass it on and retire from the queue, a balancing Cecil began to squint with puzzlement through his pink goggles.
"Is that you, Edwin?"
Panicking, Edwin propelled the pineapple tramway, sending poor Cecil headlong into the pond with a tremendous splash, immediately followed by a polite clapping.
"Jolly good shot."
"Oh, yes, rather." The last stop on the Baskerville Express was a beloved gathering in the entrance hall where everyone received their respective hats and coats and were promptly asked to leave. But as a consolation, all were given a toffee for good vigour. As Edwin was making a grateful exit, he heard Lady Baskerville's little bell from behind him. He turned pensively.
"I find you very handsome,"
she said, avoiding eye contact.
"Perhaps you could pay me a visit sometime. The candle light of oneself is measured in wick length, and it does flicker from time to time. No responsibilities, of course. Simply social. Think it over."
She then rang her little bell again and retired up a grand staircase, with the help of the help. This unexpected end to the night stayed with Edwin for a number of days. Eventually, he did pay a visit to Lady Baskerville, or Anne, as he would grow to call her, for this visit led to several more visits. She was, of course, a woeful widow and childless by all accounts, but not through lack of trying, and although Edwin was willing to step forth as a great source of companionship, there was for him an ulterior motive, a reason for getting close to an old lady at the end of her life. The building, you see, Baskerville House, was not for public purchase, and Lady Anne's freehold of the property was only due to her past marriage to a minor monarch. When she passes, the building will be passed back to the council and turned into a library, or something of the like. Why must it go to them? They do not appreciate what a treasure it is. I want it. It's worth a fortune. There must be a way. There is, but oh my, I can't. Possible, though. Perhaps a marriage, perhaps adoption, a change in her will. Eventually, after a few years of careful grooming, he moved into Baskerville House under the title of live-in friend. Indeed, Mr. Bronzeway was cunning and clever, far cleverer than his former penniless self, but the cost was evident. He was far, far, far away from the simple, girl-kissing charmer he once was. Chapter 5. It was an odd pairing, Edwin and Lady Baskerville, but strangely enough they complemented each other. He gave her company, and she provided him the cultured education he so badly needed, by her account. She taught him the best she could in the art of manners, etiquette, painting, philosophy, and her personal favourite, poetry, and with this she introduced him to the great English poets of the past, Shelley, Byron, Thomas, the other Shelley, and that fat fellow, which conveniently could all be found in one book, which he kept by his bedside, entitled The Wind of the Age, Poets and Patrons. It became a night-time ritual to read a poem a night before he went to sleep, even though they inspired horrible nightmares, which were almost exclusively about his childhood. In his dream, at this very moment, the little hovel is on fire, smoke tumbling down into the dark corners. Elle is 8 again. The smoke has poisoned her. She lies dead in the family bed while standing as a ghost in the centre of the room, and amidst the ominous smoke a tall, cloaked figure appears before her, and with Edwin's gated lids twitching in the night, his dream played out before him. Elle's logic? Do not fear me, young Elle, for you've died in your sleep. So come with me now, there is many to meet. But I'm so very young, the young girl said. My life was so short, do I have to be dead? Indeed it is so, said the tall dark cloak. You're troubled, I'm sure. We can't help the smoke. But I see you are death, said the child, smiling and sure. If I can persuade, to my body restore. But what could you say? The spirit replied. You better be quick, the fire's a bride. Quick in tongue, Elle made a bold face. Young I am much, precisely the case. Young is your case? The grim echoed back. What is your logic? Pin me that tack. The logic of goats without clothes is a curious thing. They get 'em barest. Ain't that a zing? Humorous girl, I've never heard it before. Whimsy is new to me. Do you know any more? Better still I dance, said Elle with a graceful prance, swirling and whirling with a doorway glance. You're a talented soul, that much is clear, but we really must go, 'tis an axe I can hear. Why watch a shadow bracing a blaze, when one could recite the kingdom of days? Coming closer, the cloak with impatience and mirth, she pucks and projects for all she is worth. My lord, 'tis a flower upon the crown that I did pluck this morn to lift thy frown. You're making me stern, rattled the gloom. Where is your body amongst the room? What body is this? I see not a thing. Do you know, Molly, it's a jolly good sing. Enough and no more, with a grab of her wrist, dragging her forth to an empty abyss. Molly comes lightly and Molly comes through. Oh, so unsightly, it's Molly Maru. Why are you slipping? They never pull back. What was your logic? What was the tack? You gave me your time, said the nightgown bell. We all bend for time, even you. Farewell. And so she did, fair Elle, through the window so high, in the garden alive with a gasp and a cry. And cry Edwin did. In fact, he woke up crying, and to be woken by one's own sorrow is a terrible thing. Sitting up in bed, he lit an early pipe, earlier than usual. Puff, puff. Then, by the dim light of the grand fireside, he grumbled out of bed with a sense of relief that Elle, as a little dream child, was clever enough to survive his wicked sleep state, and with a held breath he tossed the book of influential poets into the fireplace and watched it burn with a sombre sulk. I warned you, all of you, what would be if it happened again. Sighing, he clambered back into bed, feeling very middle-aged. What an awful start to the day, and on this day, this big and difficult day. For the forest was beckoning. The Goldlock by now was much easier to find due to the amount of cakes it was eating, and had now grown almost as tall as Edwin and resembled a living haystack, yellow and wide and wading amongst the trees. But, concerningly, his use for the Goldlock was growing less and less. His buildings for rent were turning more profit than it could produce gold, and because of this he found himself visiting the Goldlock not in pursuit of gold but out of obligation. He felt guilty, which again will never do, he thought. So, in an effort to increase the Goldlock's output, he hired a pony and cart, piled it high with as many pretty cakes as it could carry, and set out via the easiest route through the forest, seeking for furry yellow in the distance, while walking alongside the pony, holding its reins as it clip-clopped the woodland path. Upon finding the Goldlock, Edwin would very often just sit with it around the rock-ring fire in the silence. By this time, conversation, or indeed any form of pleasantry, had become harder than ever. The only thing Edwin could liken it to was that of visiting an old aging parent or grandparent, where one sits in silence, where one makes an effort to talk about the day, to talk about anything small and easy, but knowing full well the other person isn't even listening. Furthermore, when the Goldlock did acknowledge him, it would look with confusion, forgetting who he was. Then it would blink, and its memory would return, most of the time. The forest seemed quiet on this day. The wild wind was sleeping, and its significant other, the ready rain, was running rampant to the north. But not here. Here was peaceful. Usually on days such as this, Edwin would stay for as long as he could, for the wood was still his sanctuary, his place of peace in the world, the invisible birds lightly chirping beside the leaves, the smell of oak and dew, the still pony shaking its mane and red reins by a tree of cedar. But today he couldn't stay. I must go now, he thought. He was needed back at the town for 2, and it was already 1. So for the sake of time, speed and distance, he decided to leave the pony in the care of the heir. I'm leaving the horse here. If it gets hungry, it will eat the grass. Don't feed it icing sugar. I'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow. The Goldlock looked up at him quizzically from the low log it was sitting on.
Ho, yo!
Impatient, Edwin gave a loud huff and shrugged his way away through the trees. Unlike him to be so dismissive of the Goldlock, but things were going wrong in the town and took up a great deal of his concern. His business affairs were being bullied by a rival company. He was also being sued by no less than 12 shop owners for charging extortionate rent prices, and more so than this, his 2 o'clock engagement was to be held at the flat above the bakery. The Dimble doctor was coming. His terrible dream had been something of a premonition. Elle was ill, and had been since the previous week. I don't understand it. I just don't understand it. She was grand a few weeks ago, said Glenn, the bearded flower man, who was now living with her and was also her fiancé. 2 nurses were dabbing a sleeping Elle's forehead as Edwin arrived through the door. A grey-haired doctor called him over to a quiet corner. Oh, how he hated corners! a stern doctor, white coat and all. The results are back from last week. We're not entirely sure what's ailing her, but her sense of taste and smell appears to have vanished overnight." As he said this, Edwin overheard the two nurses talking in the hall. "It attacks the lungs, apparently," said one in a whisper. Before Edwin's helpless temper could bubble to the surface, he was distracted by Glenn's flustered voice calling from the kitchen. "Would anyone care for a cup of tea, Doctor? Hot tea? Oh dear, the milk's on the turn. I'll pop out and get a fresh one. If my love wakes, tell her I've gone for semi-skimmed." The bearded Glenn then clothed himself with an ugly orange coat and left through the door. Casually, the doctor continued to gabble with a multitude of long words that seemed to get even longer the longer he spoke. A vague Edwin, meanwhile, tuned in at the last with a blinking realization. He hadn't been listening to a single word. "Could you give us a moment?" said Edwin. The doctor grabbed his hat and bag. "There's nothing more that can be done. Today, anyway. Just let her rest. Au revoir." As the door slammed, a second time, with the plod of leaving nurses, an ill Elle woke from her slumber. "Hello, brother," she said weakly, looking up from the sheets with a damp rag, cooling her brow. "You come to make fun? Back of the queue?" She did indeed look pale, very pale, almost matching the white cotton quilt that enveloped the bed. Taking her hand, Edwin kneeled down beside the side. "All that bread's going to go stale, you know." Airing the smallest of chuckles, Elle quickly diminished into a heavy cough as she patted her chest. "Don't make me laugh, you sod." Weaker still, her chestnut head rested back on the pillow. "Do you remember that game we used to play?" she said sleepily, "where you had to throw the little stones into that hole at the top of the wall?" Tenderly, she squeezed his hand. "I do. I think it was for a water pipe." "I remember you got 3 in a row once," she said. "Did I? I don't remember." "I remember." Edwin turned thoughtful, his eyes gliding ray-like over the quilt. "I remember some things. Other things. Be careful with other things. I've forgotten most of them." They both then fell into the gentle silence they were so very comfortable with, listening to the quiet apartment, taking turns to squeeze each other's hand as Edwin lowered his head to her arm, rolled it around and mumbled slightly. "I've brought you something. Apologies if it's an other thing." As he lifted his head, Elle felt something cold being slipped on her little finger. It was the child-sized thimble she had lent to him all those years ago when they were children. Elle blinked and blinked again in disbelief. "You had it. I wondered where this had gotten. For years I looked for this. I gave it to you, didn't I? Silly me," she said softly. "I forgot it was made of tin. It was bigger back then. Too big for my thumb it was. Now look at it. Perhaps it shrunk." It was then that the sound of fast footfalls coming up the stairwell gave rise to a goofy Glenn, barging through the front door with a bearded grin. "They were out of semi-skimmed. All the skinny cows must be on a day trip to Brighton." As he carried a bag of light shopping into the kitchen, Edwin rose to his expensive shoes and kissed Elle along her burning forehead. "I'll leave you to rest. I will make time and drop in every other day till you're better." Before Elle could respond, Glenn's hairy face appeared via a dropped serving hatch. "Is the doctor gone? What bother? I was going to ask him about my athlete's foot." "Oh, well, a cup of tea?" No, thank you. I'm leaving." Somberly, the front door swung to the exit of a leaving Edwin, Elle's persistent cough ragging his ears, as he grouched down the stairs in a mad and worried mood. "What can one do? Money doesn't solve this," he thought. Her cough was that of their mother's. Perhaps it was hereditary, perhaps ill fortune, or both. Either way, his foul manner survived to the following morning. With Edwin's early rise, the ready rain lightly returned, with a strong chill, spattling the town the best it could while presumably distracted elsewhere. The forest was equally cold and wet and woeful as he slip-footed the sodden soil, venturing deeper and deeper, wood for wood with an impatient snarl, eventually reaching what was now a very soggy campsite. The Goldlock was indeed still there to Edwin's dripping relief. It was crouched in a wet heap by the fire, which had gone out, the air still filled with the smoke it had left behind, and the reliable reek of the Goldlock. Approaching half-frozen, with great vapour rising dragon-like from his hot breath, Edwin observed the Goldlock's behaviour. It was rubbing its hands in the warm grey ash of the dead fire, which was slowly turning into dark sludge as it mingled with the mud. The pony was missing from its cart. "Where's the horse?" said Edwin, impatiently wiping the rain from his serious sop. The Goldlock's large blue eyes looked up from its filth and squalor.
"Who is?
"I haven't got time for this," Edwin replied desperately. "It's freezing. I can't stay here." The Goldlock, drenched and glum, then stood up and revealed its new height, which had surpassed Edwin's by a good 2.5 feet. Its large and muddy expression was lost and dim.
"Leaf is green, leaf is yellow, leaf is loose in time. Leaf lays, but yellow is green. Time is green, laying is green."
"Where is the pony?" snapped Edwin, a cold with chattering teeth. It began backing away.
"Green,
stuttered the Goldlock, nervously as its darting eyes began to well up. "The pony!" persisted Edwin. The Goldlock bowed its head like a shamed child and pointed skyward at one of the trees. Edwin looked up to see the pony's red reins hanging from one of the branches, being swayed side to side by a gentle breeze. Upon seeing this, Edwin turned numb, wandering around the camp in a daze. "It wasn't mine. It was rented. I'll have to pay for this."
"Food?"
said the Goldlock, nodding tragically. "No, no more food, ever again. I can't do this any more. I don't want you any more. I've got all I need from you."
"Edwin,"
whimpered the Goldlock, holding out its large arms like a kid to its mother. Edwin's bottom lip began to tremble. "I don't want to look at you any more. I don't want to smell your stink any more. I don't. And with that he took off into the thicket as the Goldlock sat slowly down on a rock and began to blub and howl great buckets of tears. Its sorrowful cries echoed through the trees as Edwin ran and ran and ran until the sound could no longer reach his ears, and as the faded willows blurred either side of his running rush, he declared his declaration to commit the hardest of acts, to forget, to expunge, and to leave his beloved forest forevermore, and vowed never to return, never, ever again. Chapter 6. The morning gave rise to a rough and roused Edwin, now a very old man, pulling back the sheets in his luxurious bedroom. No, surely a chapter has been torn. Indeed, believe, how much time had passed now. Years, decades. decades upon decades. Baskerville House was no longer labelled as such, but rather the prestigious and exceedingly well-known Bronzeway House. The courtyard turned into the Lady Anne Memorial Garden, and open to the public no less than twice a year. At present, Edwin, old as he was, never married, because it meant losing money. He never had children, because it meant losing even more money. Grabbing a near-leaning bed-cane, he grumbled up to a stand with a loud, "Oh, my back!" As is with age, his back hurt, his eyes hurt, his arms were weak, his legs were weak, and the less said about his knees the better. It was snowing outside. The cold window explained and framed an icing-covered town, dimple in white, ambushed in the night by an Arctic rider. Bang, bang, at the door. "Yes, yes, I'm coming," he grunted, grouching to the door with a morning yawn. His monogram dressing gown newly tied with impatience. E.O.B. The O stood for Old Fellow. Before he could reach the brass handle, the door swung open to a little girl with a bright blue bow in her hair and a bored blink in her languorous eyes, and without even looking at him, she pushed past into the bedroom and casually slinked around, touching aftershave bottles and bed corners and scuffing her little black shoes on the carpet, and then twirled her dress hem in a manner that was both blasé and boundful. With sad eyes, Edwin watched her for quite some time, resting on his stick, and eventually ventured to speak. "Back again, I see. Do you remember me from before? I gave you a book. It was a picture book, remember?" The little girl didn't answer, but she did lay her gaze upon him for a brief second before dropping to the floor and looking under the bed. In that moment, a man wearing a sharp suit appeared at the door and immediately threw up his arms. "Oh, I don't believe it! He's not even dressed yet!" The suited man then barged in likewise and started rummaging through his closet. The little girl was now hugging one of his grey, hairy legs and squeezing so incredibly tight it was giving him a cramp in his lower thigh. "I mean, really, this is your big day and you're not even dressed," said the man, turning to shout. "He's not even dressed." A prim butler walked by the door. "I knocked for hours, simply hours," said the butler, carrying on with his nose in the air. "I think the grey suit will suit," stated the man. "Or would you rather a dim navy?" Ever statued, Edwin found himself just staring at the empty doorway, an act that dismayed the man. "Oh, for God's sake, are you even listening, Uncle?" But Edwin wasn't listening. Not to the man, anyway. There was a far, far sweeter sound, the slow, low footsteps coming closer and closer towards the door, the hard hit of heels on old wood, and finally, filling the frame with a frail beauty, L in the morning, and very much older, short white hair and ravaged by wrinkles, but still smiling at him in the morning. Tapping his foot, the man lay the grey suit out on the bed. "The grey it is, then." Today was an odd day in many a way. The grand event that awaited Edwin was a ceremony. The high honour of Dimbletown Mayor had been offered to him by order of the council, and he knew exactly why. By this point, Edwin owned so much of the town it was in the council's interest that the town was in his interest, and their resounding hope that the title of mayor might incite an air of charity into Edwin's money-minded monopoly. The mayoring was to be held next door to Bronzeway House, at the town hall at 12, and it was already 11:40. The chatter of townspeople could already be heard from the window. As well as showing up, Edwin was expected to give a speech to a gathered mass, and he was not looking forward to it. Although he enjoyed the power within the title of mayor, the idea of being a leader in any capacity did not come naturally to him. Finally dressed, Edwin creaked in grey down the staircase with his sister's family in tow, only to be confronted by yet another, an elderly Glen grinning like a rounded Santa from the bottom step. "Now, that's a snazzy suit, light grey. I have a tie in that colour, not exactly that shade, but it's grey at least." "Good morning, Glen," said Edwin politely. Amidst a bundled swirl of hats and coats, 2 members of the help opened the front door to a worsening snowfall. Careful not to slip on the icy stoop, Edwin and kin ventured forth onto the crisp, white street, only to turn back to the simple town hall, which looked very dated and plain compared to the grandeur that was Bronzeway House. Upon entry, Edwin went nervous on the spot. The mob of chatting voices was deafening. Half the town had turned up and were packed in tight around an empty stage, where the fuming council were passing opinions back and forth. "Where is he?" "Bronzeway is late." "That was a terrible idea." "The man's a crook." "The man's a greedy, selfish old crackpot." "Oh, thank heavens, he's over there by the door, and he's worn a depressing grey suit. Typical." As L and Co. found seated comfort amongst the rabble, Edwin walked the side aisle like a condemned man before stepping onto the stage, his loud cane sounding harsh and grim, stamping along the boards to an empty chair. As he seated himself, a member of the council immediately stood up and sailed to a lone microphone at the edge of the platform. "Thank you all for coming. Now, the electing of a mayor has always been an important business, but I can quite honestly say we have never had this many people attend a ceremony of this sort before. But as Mr. Bronzeway is landlord of most of the shops and private housing in Dimble, I'm sure most of you will have a vested interest in what he has to say this evening. But I have no doubt in my mind that words of charity and giving will be evident and forthright, for he is a kind and charitable man with a very giving and charitable nature. So, without any further ado, will you please welcome your new mayor, Mr. Edwin Bronzeway?" To a polite clapping, Edwin walked to the podium, the microphone reverbing with an added echo as he spoke. People of Dimble, when I was asked to take the position of mayor by the people sitting behind me, I was hesitant at first, but maybe... It was then that Edwin's full attention was diverted to a little old man sitting near the front, smiling up at him. The man in question was also wearing a brand new coat, which made Edwin sweat profusely. "And I'm sorry, but is that Mr. Tuttle I see there?" With growing dismay, he put a flat hand above his eyes. "Yes, I do believe it is. How are you, Mr. Tuttle?" said Edwin, waving at him, and receiving a surprised but happy wave back from the adorable old gentleman. "Some of you may know," continued Edwin, "that Mr. Tuttle used to run the pet shop on Billington Street before having to tragically declare bankruptcy in the middle of this year, and some of you will know him personally for providing you with guinea pigs and goldfish and rabbits and lizards and, I have no doubt, the occasional parrot. But one thing you may not know about dear, kind Mr. Tuttle is that he declared bankruptcy of his beloved pet shop without paying the 2 months of commercial rent he owes to Bronzeway House. To me, But I'm not a heartless man. I sympathized with Mr. Tattle and his situation. But then I see out of the corner of my eye that kind and lovable Mr. Tattle appears to be wearing a new coat, a very expensive one, too, and a new hat at that. And yes, I do believe a new pair of gloves as well, which leads me rather nicely to the subject of charity and giving. It is clear that he has much better things to do with his money than paying off his debts, but I'm afraid until he rights this wrong, everyone who pays rent to Bronzeway House will have their rent amount doubled by the end of the year. With this sober statement, the vast majority of the town hall erupted into outrage, shouting and waving their fists in the air. "So, in summary," said Edwin passionately, "thank you for this prestigious honour, and good day." With a second loud and metallic reverb from the microphone, Edwin quickly caned his way off the stage, being angrily passed by the council as poor Mr. Tattle was descended upon by the angry crowd. "What have you done?" said one council member. "They're going to riot," said another, fleeing as fast as he could out of the hall and into the snowy street. Edwin cantered a U-shape and ran straight back into Bronzeway House and received a pre-prepared greeting from 2 maids and a balding butler holding a bottle of champagne. "Did the ceremony go well, sir?" said the butler plainly. "No, it didn't. The whole town hates me," relayed Edwin out of breath. "Very good, sir. And would sir like to cancel the party tonight?" "Certainly not. I've been made mayor, for heaven's sake. Now I'm going upstairs to my room for safety, and I am not to be disturbed." And with that he quickly ascended the staircase, just as a jeering mob began to gather outside the front door. The carpet of his study found itself chafed raw as he arrived and began passing nervously back and forth. He wanted so desperately to light a pipe, but denied himself the pleasure, a habit he had given up in an effort to live longer. Instead, he simply stroked and fondled a large block of gold he kept in his desk drawer, which always made him feel better. Knock, knock, at the study door, the slam of a drawer. Edwin turned white and scared, looking around the room for something to protect himself. "Go away, I have a gun." The creaking door slowly opened to Elle.
"Well, that was something," she said, closing it behind her and standing with her arms folded. "I don't think public speaking is one of your hidden talents. You're not really going to put everyone's rent up, are you?" Edwin found himself getting more and more upset and angry, so he turned away from her. "Everyone just takes and takes from me," he snarled. "Leeching from my life, my blood, every day, every year, nibbling bites of me, taking from me. Lord, as my witness," he slammed his cane on the desk, "I'm covered in leeches." Elle went weak in the eyes.
"What about me? I've never asked anything from you, but you did once." He could hear her placing something onto the table as she opened the door. "You might need this. Try to cheer up and maybe rethink some of the stuff you said out there. We're not staying for the party, by the way. Not our sort, your lot. We're going back home for sausages and mash, but you have a good one, you hear? Love you and that." The sound of the door being closed made him turn. His sight too old to see what was on the table, he inched himself closer towards it, and there in the closeness it revealed itself to him, staring at him from the tabletop, the little childhood thimble made of tin and so very small, the same one she had lent all those years ago, and him to her in the wake of her illness, and now it was back. But for the life of him, he couldn't remember what it meant. He knew it had some great importance, but the memory of such things had simply vanished. Chapter 7. The party had begun, and only the wealthy attended. The vain Victorias and tall Tarquins of the town, they were not remotely bothered by Edwin's speech, for the simple reason that the rich don't pay rent, but for an added sweetness they were happy as a lone leopard to have a mare who thought about money as they did. Between the milling gaggle of champagne-swilling socialites, Archie Badger was being louder than usual to a seated Edwin. Noble Archie, who by now was very fat, very bold and twice divorced, and despite all of this, hadn't changed a bit. "They're delectable faces when you said it. If only I had your view, it was profoundly beautiful." Edwin was rocking worriedly in his chair. "But Tuttle, what happened to Tuttle?" "Oh, things got carried away, naturally. They tore that little chap's clothes off, and then everyone felt bad, and a woman took off her coat to cover him." "But he's okay?" asked Edwin, who had abandoned champagne for brandy hours ago. It was then that a very elderly man, wearing a red cravat, bowed between them and began to speak, but he was so well bred that neither of them could understand a word he was saying.
"May bonsoir. I would like to commend in your specking purse."
A long silence ensued, as one of the butlers was called over to act as translator, and after a great deal of back and forth, it was eventually deciphered that the man was paying Edwin a compliment. The butler then added, a whisper in Edwin's old ear, "Sir, if I may, neglection of one's followers is a one not to follow." Anxious, Edwin nodded and stood up to address the small gathering of 20 or so people. "I would like to say a few words. It is indeed an honour to celebrate this grand occasion with no less than the cream of our far town, and as your new mayor, my first act will be—" Edwin was then interrupted by a very loud Chinese gong being bonged at the back of the room, which signalled the scullery doors to swing open as 4 burly maids waddled out with a humongous cake. Carrying it like a coffin, they laid it to rest on a table in the centre of the room. It was in the shape of Edwin's face, looking very stern in marzipan. Then, to his immense confusion, the whole room, including the help, broke into song, which sounded more like a hymn, and a very strange song at that. "All things proud and golden, all buildings rich and tall, all things wise and wealthy, 'twas us that made them all. Each little loan that's given, each little stock that falls, we made our children richer, we made up all the rules." It went on like this for quite some time, but as soon as the last bar ended, the guests started coming forth offering gifts, including a carved wooden flute, some sand from the island of St. Lucia, a big book on modern art, a moon rock, an earth rock, and finally the petrified index finger of male chimpanzee. "It is indeed one's turn, indeed, indeed," said Archie, standing up on a chair. "Our new mayor may have already guessed that the theme is most original gift. But what do you buy a man who has everything? I ask you this." But then it hit me. The most original gift for a man who has everything is the gift of having nothing. And so I took the liberty of liaising with my accountant, who just so happens to be Mr. Bronzeway's accountant, and asked him to knock up a document for this special occasion. And here it is. Archie then took a folded one-page form out of his pocket and held it up. It was all written in small print. "This is a legally binding contract for an exchange of assets, and it states in plain ink that if Mr. Bronzeway signs it, everything he owns, his buildings, his companies, his land, his everything, is to be liquidated and transferred to the Dimble Town Council, where it will be used to upgrade the orphanage and provide food parcels and shelter for the homeless during the cold winter months." A short, brief silence lingered in the air before the whole room exploded in raucous laughter. "Don't sign it too quickly there, Mayor," said a clowning Archie, causing a second eruption of big belly guffaws, while stuffing the form in Edwin's inside pocket and tap-slapping his jowly cheek for good measure. Some of the guests were so bent over in mute hysteria that the maids had to rush in with fans to prevent fainting. Others simply enjoyed the merriment and complimented Archie, declaring it the best joke gift of the year. Edwin, meanwhile, was drunk and sad and apathetic, and quite desperate for everyone to leave. But the party was far from over, and thus he had to endure the morbid sight of 20 posh party guests cutting apart his face cake and then slowly devouring his ears and his chin and his nose and his eyes. But then at last, after a handful of hours, sweet relief, they began to say good night. Not that Edwin's drinking pass was paused even for one moment, quite the contrary. A fresh bottle of whisky acted as a glass gentleman, escorting him up the stairs to his quarters. The door slammed, the clock chimed midnight, and Edwin was alone. "Why did I wish everyone gone? Being alone is worse, so much worse," he said, slurring about the bedroom. "Why didn't I have children? A wife? I should have had children. Stupid, stupid." He tried to drink, but he couldn't open the bottle. He tried to lie down, but his head went dizzy on the pillow, so instead he took to sitting on the floor. "I'm hot. I'm too hot." The temperature of his old, pale body began to rise, and the hotter he got, the more refreshing the snowbound window looked to him, with its frosted frame and falling white folly. He played with the idea of opening it to the world and perhaps even jumping out of the townhouse and landing hotly on the cool pavement snow below. But being 3 stories up, it was not recommended, and so, in lieu of this, he left his room and stumbled, drunk, down the grand staircase to the heavy front door. As he tugged at the handle, a concerned butler appeared by his side. "Going somewhere, sir?" I'm going to my sister's, to have sausages and mash," slurred Edwin, fumbling at the lock. "Sir, it's 1 in the morning and the snow has taken the town. It is not advised." "I don't pay you to advise. I pay you to open the door. Now, open it." "But I don't understand, sir. Don't you like it here? It's warm and comfortable and very stable, far more stable than that other place." "Open the door," said Edwin sternly. "Very good, sir." The front door of the house opened to a dark, whirling blizzard. After fetching the master's winter coat and top hat, the butler gave a white glove wave as Edwin crab-stepped the treacherous stoop to the pavement that was all wet sleet and slush. The door slammed as only front doors can as he continued on into the cold made worse by the wind. The town, with its dim yellow lamp lights and shop-lined streets, welcomed his whisky breath as he swayed his way along the empty cobbles, looking down at his feet with an enduring squint, for the snow was falling thick and determined to fade his vision. He walked, and he walked for what felt like an age. In his drunkenness, his feet had quite by accident acted out an old habit and taken him to the barren flat land on the edge of the forest. "What am I doing here?" he mumbled, looking stark in the unforgiving snow. With weary vapour, he approached the trees with a few hiccups. All around him seemed grey and lost and so very cold. But being gravely intoxicated, he did not feel the chill as Sobians do, and so continued on with his cane battering about the trunks. "Ah, you stupid, ouch, God, oh, no, come on, oh!" The thin branches scraped over his lumbering build, picking his damp coat and twigging in his hairy ears. "Get your hands off me!" he exclaimed, his black top hat collecting snow. "Do you have any notion of me, who I am? I am Edwin Bronzeway. I'll have you bought. I'll have you turned. I'll have you done." Confronted by a steep incline, he sluggishly climbed the white hill, but before long the steepness got the better of him. Down, down, down slid the cane man, crashing to the bottom in a lying limbo. My back, he cried, the sudden pain and new-felt frost awakening a sober mind. "Where am I? How far have I walked? How long have I talked? You harm me, Hill. I harm you." With clenched teeth, he brought his sturdy cane walloping down on the incline, causing a cover of ice to chip off and slide by him, its exposed core making an old man's eyes glint with greed, his face ghostly pale and lit up yellow in the dark dingle. It's the whole hill. The whole hill is made of gold." And then he heard it. Bum, bum, bum. The ground began to shake all around him as he looked to the east and shivered to a standing dread. If it wasn't for the whisky's placid powers, Edwin would have exclaimed in fear, but failing this, he could do nothing but look upon a gigantic shadow wading through the forest, and there by the lure of the moon he saw it. Boom, boom, boom. Giganto, elephanto, bellissimo. The Goldlock, a giant as tall as the 3-story building Edwin obsessed over. It had grown a taste for large living things since the red-reined pony, which is a very good expression. Don't eat the pony, for when someone is being greedy. The Goldlock now lived on a bloody diet of bears, deer, and copious amounts of fresh fish from the running river. Like Edwin, it, too, was near the end of its life. Its vibrant gold hair was now a dingy white, and he could audibly hear its joints cracking as it moved in agony amongst the trees. Waving his cane, Edwin called to the fir mountain in the distance. "Hello, old friend. How you've grown. How you have aged as I have aged. I see it. You—" But the Goldlock did not see a friend, but rather food. A terrifying truth that became ever more apparent by the fact that its stride was beginning to pick up speed, together with its great cave mouth opening wider as it went. "No, it's me, cried Edwin. pathetically raising his cane like a sword, only to hurry off as fast as his old legs would carry him. But the Goldlock was gaining near. He could hear close behind him the deafening weep of hard willows being torn into splinters, their trunks falling with an almighty crash, and then, as if dropped from nowhere, the moonlit clearing appeared before him, its cathedral-like oak greeting him like an old friend. Retracing a boyhood clamber, he started to climb, his elderly body limber with fear, one branch, two branch, higher and higher, achieving absolute exhaustion on the smallest of tree limbs, just out of reach of the Goldlock's hot, gaping mouth that stood below him, waiting patiently with a baritone growl. Slowly and stiffly the branch started to bend with the weight of Edwin, and alas, the cracking began. For sure, this is the end," he whimpered. Tearing up, all the blood drained from his complexion, a howling white ghost clinging on like a rare winter leaf. "I'm sorry. With all my heart, I'm sorry." Blasting his back, he began to feel the hot volcano breath of the Goldlock. I got lost. So very lost." Quickly he took Archie's contract out of his pocket, and there, with his grey hair waving in the wind, he scribbled a messy red signature just as the branch broke, and with a mortal scream he plummeted down in a terrible fright, and landed with a soft thump. The Goldlock had not eaten him. It had caught him, and echoing through the dark wood he heard its kind and booming voice.
"Hello, Edwin. Fools are no fun."
Bedded on two palms the size of lifeboats, the coiled old man looked up at an enormous face smiling gently down at him. No fun," stuttered Edwin, shivering all the while, and with this the Goldlock took to carrying him through the forest as the dawn was rising through the trees, down to lower ground, back towards the town, and in Edwin's delirium, half asleep from exhaustion, he could have sworn the Goldlock's gigantic height was beginning to shrink. Blacking out for a brief moment, he glimpsed the flat land and then the door of the hovel, which, as always, creaked when it opened. Crouching in with Edwin held, the Goldlock placed him down in one of the large armchairs by the cold fireside and covered him over with a dusty blanket. "It's so small. What a funny little creature it is," thought Edwin, as the Goldlock tinkered down by the grate, making a fresh fire. Eyelids lolling up and down, he could not comprehend whether it had left through the door, or jumped into the fireplace, or simply shrunk away to nothing. But the Goldlock was gone, for evermore. Calm and still, with the sweet song of morning birds, the light beamed through the cracked back window of the hovel, alighting the dust in the air, and there, with a grin, he thought of his time in the town of Dimble, and with one last squeeze, there did it gimble, that little tin thimble. Dear, dear thimbles are we. The End.